Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much for joining this webinar. I hope you find it an interesting introduction to our project, which we're extremely excited about and which at the moment is going very well indeed. So I'll press on, and as we've already said, save your questions, put them in the chat, and we'll deal with them at the end. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to PACCo, the Promoting Adaptation to Changing Coasts project. I'll give a bit of background to the Lower Otter Restoration Project, which forms part of it. And then we'll have a couple of virtual tours of the Lower Otter Restoration Project site. One before we started, or more or less before we started, and the almost latest position. If we'd had this webinar perhaps another week later, we could have had the very latest, but we're just a few days too early to get the October footage. And then we'll have the questions and discussion at the end. So an introduction to PACCo. It's all about climate change and adapting to climate change. And the central tenet for PACCo really is that it is better to adapt early to what is inevitable change than wait for things to break and then have to try and adapt in a backwards way, often handicapped by a position that is imposed on you by those changes and those failures. So PACCo is part of the Interreg 5A France Channel England programme, which ends next year, and our project started in January 2020 and will end at the end of March 2023. It's quite a large project. I think it's the second largest in the whole of the programme, with a total value now, following a recent small increase, of 27.2 million euros, and about 18.8 million of those euros come from the European Regional Development Fund. Of course, the project doesn't pay entirely for everything that goes on. There are contributions from all of the partners who take part in the project. And in PACCo, there are 6 partners, 3 from France and 3 from England. Our French colleagues are the Conservatoire du Littoral in Normandy, the Communauté de Communes Terroir de Caux, which is a grouping of local authorities in the area to the west of Dieppe, and the Commune de Quiberville. Quiberville is a small community on the coast of Normandy, just to the west of Dieppe. In England, our partners are the East Devon Pebblebed Heaths Conservation Trust, who manage large areas of East Devon as part for the Clinton Devon Estates, who are the landowner. DEFRA, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, are a partner too, particularly in terms of the financial management and the communications side of PACCo. And the Environment Agency is the lead partner. And it's the lead partner, and we are also the organisation who are delivering the Lower Otter Restoration Project. PACCo is about learning from what we're doing and then sharing that information with others, as is usual for cross-border projects in Interreg. It's all about helping others to learn from things that you have done or discovered. So in terms of the outcomes from PACCo, we'll deliver 2 large construction projects, the Lower Otter Restoration Project and the Basse-Saône 2050 project. That's the Lower Saône Valley. The Saône is the river that emerges into the channel at Quiberville, small river which has been significantly modified. And both the Otter and the Saône are having projects which aim to restore them to more natural conditions. As part of PACCo, we'll demonstrate the benefits of early adaptation. As I said earlier, it's not sensible to wait for things to fail. It's better to adapt early when you're still in control of the situation. We'll look at the socioeconomic and the natural capital benefits that come from projects like this. And those are widespread and manifold. And then it's also a learning curve for all of us about trying to get the best way of communicating and engaging about these projects. Change is often quite scary, and communications and engagement form a massive part of projects like this that I think we all need to learn how to do better. So as part of it, as part of PACCo, we are producing a how-to guide based on our learning and learning from other projects in order to help inform others, because there's going to be a need to do projects similar to that on the Otter and the San at many other locations as we all try to grapple with the challenges of climate change. So the two projects are located here on the East Devon coast, the Lower Otter Restoration Project at Budleigh-Salterton, which is near Exeter, and as I said, the Basse-San 2050 project, which is located basically at Quiberville near Dieppe in Normandy. And there are many similarities. I've known both these sites for a long time, having visited the San probably 10 years ago as part of another European project, and was then struck by some of the similarities between the two projects. They're not identical, of course. No sites are identical, but they have many of the same things happening with heavily modified channels and valleys, with infrastructure in place that is at risk from climate change and which needs to find solutions for a sustainable and resilient way forward. You can see on the left the Lower Otter with a shingle bar across the mouth of what was the Otter estuary. Budleigh-Salterton is off to the left in that picture, and on the right the San Valley with the community of Quiberville mainly off to the right hand side. There's another community, Saint-Marguerite-de-Mer, on the left, and you can see how the river has been constrained, certainly in the San, with lots of infrastructure on the beach and a large campsite right in the floodplain next to the river in the center of the picture. So moving on to the Lower Otter Restoration Project, a bit of clarity about where we're talking about here, and this is obviously the Southwest Peninsula, East Devon, and then on the right hand side the project boundary roughly for the Lower Otter project, which extends from the mouth of the estuary up inland some 2 kilometers. The Otter estuary has been modified significantly over time. One of the major modifications was in the early 19th century. And this is a picture of a map which the original resides in the archives at Clinton Devon Estates. This was produced by James Green, who was the county surveyor for Devon in 1809. And you may or may not be able to read it, but it says, "Plan of a piece of mudland known as the Runny." And at that time, the Otter estuary, obviously the orientation of this is with the mouth of the estuary to the right and upstream to the left. So we need to rotate it through 90 degrees to get the real north-south orientation. But James Green proposed building an embankment. It's shown on this plan, but it's a bit hard to pick out. So this was the area of the estuary in the early 19th century. Originally, the Otter was navigable all the way up to Otterton. But in the early 19th century, there was still a large area of mudflat and sandflat and estuarine channels. James Green proposed building an embankment along the lines of this red line, which clearly enclosed a large area of what was then estuary, and the intention was to convert that into agricultural land. Not an uncommon practice at the time. Here's today's map showing James Green's proposed boundary, and indeed showing what's left of the estuary. This is how things were until very recently, with the embankment in red, excluding tidal flooding from all of that area shown here below the red line. And that's what's left of the estuary. It's about a quarter of what we originally had. And with that, there's been the loss of those important habitats, intertidal habitats and subtidal habitats, which make our estuaries so important. Now, the construction of the embankments is just one of a whole range of modifications. So in terms of orientation, here in the foreground, in the centre of the picture, we've got the village of Otterton. East Budleigh is off to the right, and Budleigh Salterton in the far distance. There are two large farms which farm and manage the land within the valley floor. Pool Hayes here, and further in the distance, South Farm. We were very fortunate with this project in that almost all of the land within the valley is owned by Clinton Devon Estates, and South Farm and Pool Hayes Farm are tenanted farms within that land ownership. So the history of modification goes back a very long time. Otterton Mill is listed in the Domesday Book. Later, other things have happened. I've already talked about the construction of the embankment at the beginning of the 19th century, and that was followed by a second embankment, imaginatively called Big Bank, which was put in place to reduce flooding, the fluvial flooding, I think, that resulted as a result of the construction of the first bank. The then tenant at Pool Hayes Farm made it clear that his land was wetter than it had been before the first embankment had been created, so they built another one. Later on, the railway, here shown as a dotted purple line, was constructed, the branch line down to Budleigh Salterton, splitting the floodplain left and right. In the early 1930s, a cricket club, one of the lowest cricket clubs in England, was constructed on the ground towards the southern end of the floodplain. A road was built across the valley floor and a bridge built over the river. The Budleigh Brook, which runs in from the village of East Budleigh here, runs down through its own floodplain and then into the River Otter floodplain, and the Budleigh Brook was then carried across the valley floor in an aqueduct and down into the River Otter, down a concrete cascade, separating it ecologically from the rest of the catchment. A tip, not unusually for old estuarine areas, a tip was constructed which operated from 1928 to 1978. It started from the western end, small triangle of land, and gradually grew almost all the way across the valley floor to the new embankment. And here is our project boundary. We're not carrying out works in the upper part of this project area, but this was certainly the area that we were looking at and considering and taking account of any potential impacts on all of that area. Just to move to talk a little bit about climate change, and this will be familiar to some of you, but I think some of you will also be surprised by some of the figures that are contained here. So we know that UK average temperature rose by getting on for a degree, 0.8 of a degree between 1961 and 1990. Sea level rose by 16 centimetres since 1900, and our current forecast of likely sea level rise by 2100 is about 1.15 metres. Of course, these figures are a bit dependent on which particular scenario you're considering for climate change. And our colleagues who are working on development control are working on much larger figures, 1.9 metres in East Devon for 2120. We expect offshore wind speed and wave height to increase significantly by 10%. And we'll see wetter winters with precipitation up by about 30% by 2070, with larger rainfall events that could be 50% bigger and significantly more frequent, driving peak river flows up by 46% by the 2080s. I apologise for the different dates here. It would be nice to have everything at the same time, but that's not how it works. But what's very clear is that we've got a lot of different effects here, and of course most of those effects come together in estuaries where we get the coastal effects, the effects, the marine effects, combined with the fluvial impacts in one place. The consequences of those changes are likely to be that we'll see more frequent, bigger floods with failing of aging infrastructure. These are 3 photographs from the Otter Valley. On the left, we have significant levels of flooding. That's a road in that picture. There wasn't any tarmac left on that road after this flood. It was all ripped up. In the centre, we have a picture of the cricket club that I mentioned, flooded up to its eaves, and that has happened on many occasions over the last few decades, and increasingly frequently as time has gone on. And on the right-hand side, that is works that were taking place on the Otter estuary when we had a sudden collapse of part of the embankment, almost leading to accidental failure of the estuarine embankment. But fortunately, we were able to step in. It sounds a bit counterintuitive, but we were able to step in and carry out some temporary repairs in order that we could still carry on and deliver the Lower Otter Restoration Project in a managed way, rather than working up to our waists in water. So, key activities as part of the Lower Otter Restoration Project. We're going to create a 70-metre breach in the old embankment down here, close to the cricket club. And behind that embankment, we will construct a footbridge that will allow the footpath that runs up the estuary embankment. I've lost my cursor. we go. There's a footpath that runs up the estuary embankment here, which is the Southwest Coast Path, on which 250,000 visitors a year walk. We're going to create about 55 hectares of intertidal habitat, or restore 55 hectares of intertidal habitat as part of this project. Most of that will be mudflat with some salt marsh and a little bit of wetter floodplain grazing marsh. We're going to lower the two northern embankments. Here, Big Bank, and here, Little Bank. And those are being lowered down to floodplain level, because when those embankments were constructed, it completely disconnected the River Otter from its floodplain. Until very recently, in a flood, the river had to, the channel which was constructed when they built the embankments, the new cut, doesn't even pass the mean annual flood. So in any kind of significant flood, the water has to back up until it could overtop those embankments. And as a result, sedimentation within the floodplain, all the way down through here, has been very limited over the last 200 years. And what we've got is much greater sedimentation within the Otter estuary. The aqueduct that I showed you has been removed, and the Budley Brook is being renaturalized by putting it into a more natural channel in the floodplain. And then the road that runs across the valley floor here is being raised 2.5 meters on an embankment on top of the old tip, which in itself is being protected. That new road will include a 30-meter span highway bridge, and that will secure access to properties and land to the east of the river, for which there is no other public highway. Down at the mouth of the estuary, there is currently a pipe running along the back of the shingle bar at the mouth of the estuary, which carries a combined sewer overflow out into the channel. And that operates when a pumping station is beyond its design capacity. That pipe was vulnerable to erosion, where if we were going to see, as expected, adjustment of the shingle bar. And as a result, we've come up with a plan to replace that vulnerable pipe with a new directionally drilled pipe under the estuary. The cricket club is being relocated to a flood-free site as part of the project. The future of the cricket club, which is down here at the moment, was always limited, but fortunately we've been able to secure a new site for them here on high ground above the cliffs of the estuary, where they should have a secure future. It's a significant resource for the local community. East Budleigh-Salterton is not a very big community, and there are well over 400 members of the cricket club. And I talked about the way that the landfill site will be protected from erosion. So we're coming to the point now where we can have a look at actually what we have done. So we've been taking monthly drone flights since the beginning of construction. They have a consistent flight plan, which is recorded and fixed. We take a video right the way up and down the project area. And in addition, each month there are 35 fixed point photographs taken. So we've been able to compare what things looked like before and after, and follow the progress on the way through. The first one I'm going to show you is from April 2021, when work on site was just beginning, although it is fair to say that we had before we got to that point, we had already leveled the field for the new cricket club site. So you won't see that in the rather lumpy condition that it was before the levelling was done. And then I've got the September 2022 video to show you. And although a lot has been done, there is still plenty left to do. And then finally, there's just a few shots showing some fixed points and the comparison of what's happened in the last year. So we'll move on to these now. And this is the April 2021 footage. And what we'll see here is a view up the valley, and I'll talk us through it. So that's the shingle bar in the foreground. The cricket club on the left-hand side here, and what you can see in the centre of the photograph is the natural estuary, which is actually slightly odd in that we don't have the expected extensive mudflats together with transitional salt marsh that you would hope for in a natural estuary. But what you have is a lot of upper salt marsh and some quite restricted muddy channels. The wet areas on the left here are scrapes that were created by the estate, which were quite successful at attracting duck, particularly in the winter. The Otter Estuary is a site of special scientific interest, and actually that includes that section of reed bed there, which you can see to the west of the estuary embankment. Coming into the centre of the picture now is the old tip site, which used to have a plantation on it, poplars on the east and conifers on the left, but those were removed about 5 years ago. There's the road running across the valley floor and White Bridge on the right of the photograph. And you can see how constrained the river and its channel are between the embankment created in the early 19th century and the high ground to the east. At this point, the river used to, when it in its natural condition, used to sweep right across to the western side of the valley floor. That wetland in the middle there is an old estuarine channel. We can see the old railway line to the left of the picture here, and coming into the center of the photograph now is Big Bank sweeping across with Poolhays Farm on the left hand side. Those are access tracks that we were constructing to allow us to get plant and material into the site in April 2021. And there's the aqueduct, a concrete structure about 1/2 metre across and deep on concrete legs. This is looking further north. This is Little Bank that we're seeing here. And again, that was keeping the otter out of the marshes. Again, you can see the railway line running straight up the left-hand side. And here we're into less modified. There's no embankment here against the river. The river is free to flood on this side of the floodplain. And indeed, in a big flood, the river gets out of channel upstream of Otterton, that's the village on the right here, and spills over the railway and starts to occupy the floodplain on the left of the railway. That photo that I showed you a little earlier of the road being completely flooded is just to the left of that large property coming in the center of the frame now. Now we're going to turn round in a second and start flying back down the valley. And the floodplain of the Otter extends roughly to that road that forks off the main road there, with the properties in the centre of the photograph now, and Frogmore Road runs off down south roughly parallel to the old railway line. Those properties to the right of it are out of the floodplain, but certainly there is significant flooding on that road. And as I say, water in a big flood is on both sides of the old railway line, and indeed levels are marginally higher to the west of the railway than they are to the east. That's the village of East Budley off to the right there, and in front of us is Pullhays Farm. And you can see the aqueduct there on the left, and Big Bank again, and you get a better impression in this direction of the land which we are proposing to flood all the way down to the sea. We expect everything in Big Marsh to be inundated on pretty much every high tide. Little Marsh, because it's a little bit higher, will only inundate on big tides, mostly around the spring tides. The land off to the right there is higher. The floodplain is more constrained down towards the to the river, and indeed as we move down we'll have cliffs on the western side of the river. In the center of the frame here, what we see is the trunk drain, which is essentially an agricultural drainage setup. When I first started working on the site, the cross stitches were bringing water into the low-level carrier, which they were then pumped up into a high-level carrier using a huge diesel engine pump. Here we've got South Farm Road crossing the valley floor, the tip in front of us, and that drain continues under South Farm Road. Those bare fields there in front of us are the one at the bottom of the frame is the new location for the cricket club. That field, that bare field there, was being prepared for siting the new compound, operation works compound. And there you can still see the trunk drain running down towards the sea with another footpath running down beside it. One of the reasons why we had to consider building a large and expensive footbridge behind the breach was because all the other options for locating it were already occupied by footpaths, and so that would have meant effectively a closure and a likely public inquiry to deal with that. Large public car park adjacent to the shingle bar, and you can see now this channel, this straight channel, is from an Environment Agency outfall which takes water off in times of flood, but the trunk drain continues out through a culvert under the beach and into the sea. So we'll move on now to September 2022. I hope everything's going okay in the way of interpretation for you. There's a lot to assimilate there, I'm sorry. So, September 2022, a lot of change. Hopefully it won't be too hard to spot. Actually, I was on site yesterday. The cricket club has now been demolished. The tractor shed has been demolished. And we've started construction of the new tidal creek, which will come right through to the area of breach here. We've got a diversion of the public footpath in here, and here is the new tidal creek, which will bring water into the site on a rising tide and allow it to drain effectively on a falling tide, so that we end up with a fully drained estuary on a falling tide at low tide. Here in the center of the picture, you can see that all the trees have been removed from the old tip. And as we get a bit closer, we'll be able to see the new embankment, which will carry the new road, raised road, along and over the tip. Here is the bridge which is being constructed to take the road over the new creek system. You can see we're constructing a series of secondary and indeed tertiary creeks, and we're confident that they will change to allow the development of a proper dendritic creek system over time. The ground is still incredibly soft. It hasn't been panned here at all, and it's been a real challenge working on it. Here's our new tidal creek running across the valley floor and all the way up to the top of the site. What we've done here is include material on the back of the old river embankment to increase its resilience and resistance to any potential wave erosion driven by westerly winds. The westerly winds here are predominant, and there's a bit of land, a bit of space available in order to get a bit of wave generated, and we hope that this will protect the embankment from that. On the western side of the valley floor, the footpath has been improved and raised, although it will still inundate on the biggest tides. And then in front of us here, we can see Big Bank. Here, stone, where this section has been lowered to floodplain level. There's a culvert through the embankment, or through the through what was the embankment here, and that carries the tidal creek through that section and on up into Little Marsh. We've removed trees from the ditches throughout the site for a number of reasons. Obviously, they would die due to inundation with salt water, and on other sites where they have not been removed, that's proved not to be a very popular thing. And certainly there are good ecological reasons for removing them. We're trying to create habitat here that will be valuable for waders and wildfowl. And waders in particular like to have uninterrupted sight lines so that they can see when predators are coming. And of course, there is a risk that dead trees would trap debris, whether that's human, man-made debris or indeed natural materials. So that's why we've removed all of the trees. And what we can see already is how we've achieved a much more open and more natural looking landscape. You can see here at the bottom of the picture, we were still in the process of removing the last bits of the aqueduct when this footage was taken. That's now completely gone. And here in front of us, Little Marsh, Little Bank, lowered to floodplain level so that when the River Otter floods, it will be able to spill into its floodplain as it should and occupy the floodplain as it should do. We'll just, hello? So this is coming back down the valley again. I'm sorry about that, a little bit of interruption there. Coming back down the valley, here's the new bridge over the new tidal creek. There's the cricket grounds to the left of us, to the right of us there, and the site compound off to the right. You can see all the material stockpiled on the old tip site, which will be leveled and then replanted, replacing trees that have been lost as part of the project. There are many hundreds of trees going in on that new, on the old tip, and indeed a footpath is being diverted onto the old tip to replace one which has for many decades been completely inaccessible within the floodplain because it disappears into a reed bed and deep water. Coming back down then, and you can see how the works that we've done this summer had stopped short of the cricket ground. The cricket club played out their final fixtures in mid-September here, and then as soon as they'd finished, we were able to move in and start the construction works to link up to where the breach will be, because we are planning to breach here early in spring next year. And that is about it in terms of the visual tours of the site. And we'll move on to just a few pictures showing comparisons between April 2021 and September 2022. Site overview, and I think it's plain from this actually how the landscape has changed already quite dramatically across the length of the site. It's very, very clear when you start. This is a view looking west along South Farm Road, with the old tip off to the left. We had some very interesting challenges with the old tip because it was deemed to be dormouse habitat, and so all of the work to clear that could only be done either in May or September and October, and involved fingertip searching by teams of ecologists before painstaking clearance bit by bit to ensure that no dormice were harmed. We didn't find very many in the end, but the ones that were there were certainly very well looked after. On the right-hand side, you can see the new road to the adjacent to the old road. The old road, lowest spot on the old road was at about 1.2 meters above ordnance datum, and highest astronomic tide for the Otter estuary is 2.8 meters above ordnance datum. So you can see why we needed to think about constructing a new road. We did investigate the possibilities of leaving it tidal, but certainly the emergency services were not in favour of that. We're in the very fortunate position that Devon County Council have agreed to adopt the new road and the new bridge, and it has been built to pretty exacting standards. This is the view looking north of the floodplain, and you can see how we've gone from having significant trees and shrubs along all of these cross drains across the marsh, to no trees, with the exception of one. If you've got really good eyesight, you'll be able to spot one here which had a bat in it, and therefore we've left. But the creek network is clear to see here, and we've incorporated the old ditches where possible, sometimes with some small bunds to isolate sections and avoid them interfering with our drainage network, but we've incorporated them where we can. And you can see again here, down alongside the river embankment, where we've reinforced the old embankment, and we hope that what we'll get on here, although this main centre part of the site will be mudflat, we hope that we will get establishment of some salt marsh along here. As some of you may be aware, salt marsh we are now much more aware that salt marsh is an excellent habitat for sequestering carbon and storing carbon long term, so that'll be pretty valuable. And here is the better view of the new cricket ground on the right hand side. So in the April 2021 picture, that had just been levelled, and now in September we've got the two new squares. So they've got a senior square and a junior square, and in the between the two of them is where the new pavilion is to be built, and the club will be playing on that ground as of spring next year. And finally, I think, the new road bridge construction. We've removed part of the end of the old tip here in order to be able to construct the new bridge, which is has abutments at either end and then 2 piers in the middle. The bridge deck's now been poured, and in fact, when I was there yesterday, all of the formwork had been removed, and the bridge deck was looking largely finished. So the road then runs through here, again parallel to the old road, and connects back into the network up through there. That's the site compound to the side there. Okay, well that's it really for the tour. Here's where you can find out more, but you've seen this already in Lydia's slides, and the social media connections. So really, thank you for listening, and over to you for some questions. I'll stop sharing.